There is so much of photography that I only understand on a surface level, and if you're like me, you learned everything you know about photography through YouTube, and while that's a great resource for learning, it's not the most comprehensive. But recently, the science-inclined part of my brain has been craving more sufficient, more detailed answers about cameras, film, optics, and all sorts of other stuff that I don't have a deeper understanding of. So I got to researching. And it turns out that my very first photographic inspiration from way back in 7th grade, Ansel Adams, wrote a series of books all about this. The 3 books, The Camera, The Negative, and The Print, all come together to form a tremendous body of knowledge about the photographic process. Once I learned about this book, I knew that I had to check it out, so I was going to Strand every week to see if they had it in stock, and eventually I finally found it and picked up a copy. And just like that, the book delivers. When I started reading The Camera, I was learning new information almost instantly, and by the time I was 50 pages in, I was convinced that this was an essential piece of reading for anyone who wants a better understanding of photography. If you're a somewhat experienced photographer, the concepts in The Camera won't be entirely new to you. Instead, Ansel Adams connects the dots for you, helping you synthesize bits of information you already know into one well-connected photography network. Now, I'm not going to attempt to paraphrase the book in this video. That's simply not possible. This book is so densely packed with information that the ideas really can't be concentrated further, and if I did, I'd be doing his writing a disservice. So instead, I want to convince you to read this book by sharing with you 5 concepts that I learned much more about from this book alone. So let's get into it. Okay, so this first one is my favorite, and I really think it'll help out the digital shooters to understand this concept. So let's see how I do. Have you ever wondered why an 85mm lens on a 35mm body looks like a tight portrait lens, but another 85mm lens on a medium format body looks really wide? I know I have, and this is a great example of something that I intuitively understood in practice, but didn't understand the reasoning behind it. So let's break this down with what I learned. Generally speaking, every lens of the same focal length will have the same visual coverage. It'll make a circular image, like this. The difference between formats is how much of the circle is being used. So an 8x10 would use a large portion of the circle, 4x5 would use less, and 35mm would use a very small amount. This explains why an 85mm makes for a portrait lens on 35, but a landscape lens for large format. Because the physical exposure size is smaller for 35mm, the person takes up more of the frame. So when you move up to larger formats with the same focal length, your subject will be taking up a smaller portion of the total exposure. I think I did a good job there. Hopefully those animations helped. But anyways, speaking of large format, let's talk a little more about that. Now, fair warning with this book, Adams talks a lot about large format photography, which will never be relevant to 99% of us, but that's not without good reason. The reason he talks so much about large format photography is because the amount of precision control it offers you when taking photos, especially the landscape photos that he's so well known for. You simply cannot get this sort of image control with any of the conventional photography formats that we're used to. And while I don't see myself applying everything that I've learned about large format photography anytime soon, it was very interesting to see what the adjustments do to a final image. And when I take the time to mull over what I've learned about large format photography, the rising adjustments, the falling adjustments, the swing back, and all that stuff, I really understand how slow this format is, how clumsy it is, and how methodical you have to be with your adjustments to get great results. And this is so interesting to me right now because so many of us are going back to film for the imperfections that it has baked in, myself included. And meanwhile, Ansel Adams was fighting his whole career in using large format to take film photos that achieve perfection through technical mastery. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing or anything. I think reading from this book is just a great opportunity to understand how much of a master this person was of his craft, and you can see that in the photos.
When you took this particular photograph, did you know in your mind's eye what it would turn out to be?
Yeah. It was going to be a silhouette. I had hoped I could hold a little more definition here, but the light was changing very fast, and I trusted to memory rather than to another reading. I could have had a little more in here, but there's nothing in the negative, so it has to be printed very deeply.
One of the first things we learn in photography is that decreasing the size of your aperture increases your depth of field. So your f/22 shot is going to have a lot more acceptable sharpness than your f/2.8 shot. The hyperfocal distance, fancy word, uses this fact to our advantage to maximize our depth of field and image sharpness. Now when we set our plane of focus, we have areas of acceptable sharpness both in front of and behind this plane. So with that in mind, imagine you're taking a landscape photo and you set your focus all the way out to infinity. You're actually losing depth of field because you're only taking advantage of the plane of focus and the depth of field in front of it, not behind it. Instead of setting our focus out to infinity, the hyperfocal distance tells us where we should set our focus to maximize this depth of field. Now this is dependent on your camera, your settings, and your lens, so I'll use an example from the book to explain it. When using an aperture of f/22 and focus to infinity, the near limit of depth of field, or hyperfocal distance, is 18 feet. So when you focus at the hyperfocal distance of 18 feet, you're maximizing your depth of field so that you have acceptable sharpness from 9 feet all the way to infinity. Now I'll admit, hyperfocal distance can seem a bit complex, partially because they don't seem to make lenses with distance scales on them anymore, but it's definitely a concept worth understanding, especially if you're a landscape photographer who's looking for that really nice sharpness from front to back. This book included plenty of information about filters, but probably the most digestible piece of information I got was this. The general principle to remember is that a filter will lighten its own color and darken the complementary color as recorded on black and white film. And this explains to us right away why we see things like yellow filters being used for black and white film landscape photography. It's because it makes that sky more dark and contrasty, and I'm guessing, although don't quote me on this, that it also lightens the greens a little bit because that's close to yellow. I'm just guessing. Additionally, I learned about UV filters and how they interact with chromatic aberration. Basically, black and white film can see ultraviolet wavelengths, and this will often result in unsharp images. But if you use something like a UV filter or a skylight filter, it'll cut out these wavelengths and give you sharper results. When I bought my film camera, actually, it came with a UV filter on it, and I was thinking like, I don't really know what this does, but at the very least, it seems like a clear protective filter, so I guess it's fine. Turns out I had a pretty good reason to be there. The book also talks about other filters too, but I'll let you guys read that. And it also says that it talks about filters more in depth in the negative, which I'll be reading very soon. One of my favorite moments while reading this book was when Adams wrote about using zoom lenses. And remember, this book was written probably somewhere in the 1970s and last published by him in the 1980s. So keep that in mind when I read this quote. Moving subjects and changing conditions also invite the use of zoom lenses, and the best of these have improved in quality to the point where there is relatively little penalty in optical sharpness. 40 years ago, at least 40 years ago, he was saying that there was very little optical quality degradation when it comes to using zoom lenses. The gear we have today is so good. It is so more than acceptable. There's a few more quotes throughout the book that are similar to this, but they all have the same point. When Adams wrote this book, presumably around 45 years ago, he found the gear of that time to be more than functional for his needs. At this point, gear is barely a limiting factor when it comes to producing great work. We have so many choices and so much of it is solid, and I think it should push us to consider if we even care about apparent sharpness on a very micro level, or if we really need an f1.4 instead of something that an f.8 when it works. Whew. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that felt like a lot of information. I walked away from this book with an entirely new understanding of photography, a whole different mental perspective about the medium, and that's why I'm encouraging you guys to read it so much. There is so much to be learned from this book, and I already picked up a copy of the negative to continue learning more. And by the way, the negative is much more technical and focuses more on film development, so I wouldn't consider it as essential as a book like The Camera, which talks about all sorts of different, more basic concepts. Now, I bought this copy of the book new from Strand for $25. I think you can order it online if you want. I'll leave a link in the description. But you can get it on eBay or many used book websites if you want an older edition for probably like 10 bucks. And I think if you put some time into it, you could find a very, very, very discounted version somewhere online. But I do want to take a second to flip this back on you guys. So if you learned anything from this video, or if you find yourself picking up a copy of The Camera, be sure to let me know with a comment down below, or subscribe to my newsletter and drop a comment there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, especially because this was a pretty technical video. So thanks for sticking around. But I'll see you guys in the next one real soon. Whew, we did it.